This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. We recently posted an interesting debate on the new Mass. We encourage all of our readers to listen to the entire thing. Many important issues come up which are crucial in demonstrating that the new Mass is without question invalid, and many facets of the whole topic are addressed, including how to refute arguments that are made in defense of the new Mass. So we hope that the people will listen to the entire thing. But I want to offer some highlights and some additional thoughts on some key points and things we heard in the debate. We really hope that the people who might not even like our stuff or who feel inclined to agree with the Vatican II Church, we hope that they will listen to this entire debate with an open mind. Because if they do and try to be honest about it, they will see that every single thing that is brought up by the other side is addressed and in fact refuted. For example, William, my opponent in the debate, threw out things such as no doctor of the Church denied that this is my body, this is my blood is all you need for a consecration. And I immediately refuted that, citing St. Thomas Aquinas with a specific reference to the Summa Theologica, and actually quoted him. Here's the actual exchange from the debate.
In fact, there is no doctor of the Church, not one, that agrees that the short form does not suffice. And as such, this is a ridiculous argument. I will now surrender the rest of my time to Peter Diamond.
Okay, wow, there's a lot of false statements to refute there. No doctor of the Church has ever said that the short form doesn't suffice. Well, St. Thomas himself says that. He says it in 3 different places. He says it in Summa Theologica Part 3, Question 78, Article 3. He said, some say this is the chalice of my blood is all you need. And he says this seems incorrect. Okay? It's just ridiculous to say that according to you. Well, you obviously don't have the first clue what you're talking about. St. Thomas Aquinas says that very thing.
And so this is the type of false argument which is circulated in circles and on videos, but which you can't get away with in a debate. And that's why I'm so glad this debate occurred, because it shows that this dishonesty, these false arguments, yes, they can be effective to people who aren't really searching for the truth and when no response can be given. But when they're put out in the format that we had, they are refuted soundly. We also saw him argue repeatedly that the institution accounts in the Gospels, simply because they're in the Gospels or in the New Testament, therefore constitute valid forms of consecration. And that was refuted by pointing out that St. Thomas Aquinas specifically took an objection on that point in the Summa, and I gave the specific reference. It comes in Part 3, Question 78, Article 3, Reply to Objection 9, saying that, quote, the evangelists did not intend to hand down the forms of the sacraments. Their object was to write the story of Christ. But because my opponent obviously still is bogged down by a Protestant methodology, as I pointed out in the debate, he thinks that just because it's in Scripture, it must be a sufficient sacramental form. And this was a big point he brought up. This is also refuted, as I pointed out in the debate, by the more authoritative papal decrees on what is necessary for a consecration, but you can listen to the debate for all of that. There are so many different things that come up which were refuted that my opponent said that I'm not going to cover many of them here, but I want to highlight a couple in particular because they're very interesting. Really, 2 arguments stood out that my opponent made in this debate. The first was that all is acceptable in the consecration because there's an ancient consecration formula used by St. Ephraim that says all. And I refuted this by pointing out and referring him to an article in the Catholic Encyclopedia under West Syrian Rite, which explains that there are many ancient anaphoras and consecration prayers which are circulated, which are not legitimate, and which the Church has never approved. I also cited Pope Benedict XIV, who specifically made reference to missals, breviaries, etc., which were corrupted, especially in the eastern part of the Church. And so just because something isn't in an ancient text doesn't mean it was approved for the consecration. And I further pointed out the absurdity of this argument, because if it were true, then it would make a mockery out of St. Thomas, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, Pope Benedict XIV, St. Alphonsus, who all said all is not acceptable in the consecration. So his main argument was soundly refuted. But what's so interesting, and this really speaks to the level of dishonesty we're dealing with this fellow William Albrecht, And it's more than that, it's actually monumental intellectual fraud. Because when you actually examine the specific reference and quote, and see, if you listen to this debate, and I encourage everyone to listen to the whole thing, you can see that when I cite things, I give specific references. I give specific references to the Catechism of Trent, or the Summa, or a papal decree, or an encyclical. He doesn't do that. And the reason is because it's all specious argumentation where he throws things out there in which, if you actually examine what they're saying, it's not at all favoring what he has to say. And I'm going to give a clear example of that. And there are actually two examples I want to look at. And the first one refers to the Council of Trent. In the debate, I guess because everything else he was saying was being refuted, and I was bringing up many documented sources and facts which refute him, I guess he felt the need to simply fabricate arguments. And so he said that the Council of Trent formally defined Luke 22 as being sufficient for consecration, and the other forms. He said this repeatedly, and even after the debate. He said this probably 4 to 5 times. And I pointed out that this is completely untrue. It did not make any dogmatic definition on what is necessary for a valid consecration. Anyone who studies that argument knows that. But he obviously doesn't. And so that's why I asked him in the debate, I said, what's your reference? And he curiously wouldn't give it to us. We'll see in a second why. Well, I actually pointed out in the debate itself why. It's because it doesn't teach what he's saying at all. What he's saying is simply a lie. And even though I repeatedly asked him for the reference, and it would have been easy for him to cite the session and the decree, the chapter number, or even a Denzinger number, but he didn't because the argument's fraudulent. But the closest we got to discovering what he's talking about was he said that,
I'm really hoping that Peter Diamond is able to engage with some of the arguments I brought forth. And as I said, if he can topple any of them, Peter Diamond has won the debate. I still don't understand where he's dealt with the fact that Matthew 26, which does use formality, and Luke 22:19 and 1 Corinthians 11:23 are all formally defined by the Church, by the Council of Trent. In fact, maybe Peter Diamond will have a chance to pop open his Denzinger, and he can look through it and find just where we read this. It was officially decreed that these word texts show the reality of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
And so, using the hints that he gave us, because he refused to give us the reference, we can discover what he's talking about and see just how dishonest Mr. Albrecht is. What he's referring to comes in the Council of Trent's Decree on the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, Chapter 1. You can find this in Denzinger 938. And in this decree it says that Jesus Christ offered to God the Father his own body and blood under the species of bread and wine, and under the symbols of those same things gave to the apostles, whom he then constituted priests, so that they might partake. And he commanded them and their successors in the priesthood in these words to make the offering. Do this in commemoration of me, etc. Luke 22:19, 1 Corinthians 11:24. As we can see, the Council of Trent is not even addressing, let alone declaring, that certain words are necessary for a valid consecration. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's rather simply saying that Jesus Christ instituted the sacrament of the Eucharist and made them priests and commanded them to make the offering when he said, do this in commemoration of me, and citing where those specific words, do this in commemoration of me, can be found. Luke 22:19, 1 Corinthians 11:24. It is not remotely addressing what is necessary for a valid consecration, and most certainly not saying that Luke 22:19 is sufficient for a valid consecration. So it's simply a bold falsehood, as I said over and over again in the debate, but nevertheless he continued to make the same false argument dishonestly. And obviously, as I mentioned in the debate, Mr. Albrecht doesn't understand Catholic teaching. The apostles were offering the sacrifice, and the first Christians were celebrating Mass before the New Testament was even completed. And so what's written in Luke 22 is simply a snapshot of what Jesus did. It is not recording everything he said at that event, and we know that from Matthew 26, which gives us more of his words. And we also know from the tradition of the apostles, as the Church has taught, that there are more words that Jesus used when instituting the sacrifice than we have even in Scripture. And so now we know why he refused to give us any reference, because it is, like all of his others, a fraudulent argument. And the same thing, interestingly, occurs with regard to his second main argument. When we look at what St. Ephraim, this quote that he brought up, and which I refuted by all the things I mentioned, that these were not validly approved consecration forms. He cites this alleged consecration prayer attributed to St. Ephraim, which says, "This is truly my blood, which is shed for all of you." Well, what's so fascinating, and further confirms exactly the point I'm making, is that this comes from St. Ephraim's homilies 4:4 and 4-6. It's a homily. It's not a consecration prayer. And I will talk more about that and some other very interesting things that occurred in the debate in the next part.